mentioned.
Okay, it's gone.
That's it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Kurki, and I'm chairperson of this panel, right in, and also a coordinator with Essential Discussions. And I want to welcome you here today. Today we're going to examine some of the tools that are available in István Mészáros' recent work and see how they can be applied to the current situation. And so we'll be commenting on the material chronologically, the most recent material. Doug will start out, and I will follow, and Mario will finish up. And then we'll have time for an open discussion. For people that are thinking of things they need to do afterward, we should be able to wrap up by 11:30 or so. So I think we'll start right in. Doug, do you want to take over?
Sure. I'm Greene. I've been an activist here at Occupy Boston since it began on September 30th. I'm affiliated with the Kasama project, the Howard Zinn Memorial Lecture Series, and I'm an editor of the Boston Occupier. And my talk is going to deal with Mészáros' work, which is largely derived from Beyond Capital, the historical actuality of the socialist offensive, also dealing in part with the structural crisis of capital. And to begin, in 2007 and 2008, it was brought home to us that history had not ended despite what Francis Fukuyama had proclaimed. In many ways, there was a delayed reaction on the part of the left and the working class to the economic crash. Since previously, we had to endure the mantra of hope and change from Obama, and the resulting, and I would argue, inevitable disappointment of his presidency, which had a sobering effect on many erstwhile supporters. It was during the Obama presidency the continued bank bailouts while austerity was promised for the popular classes. The political system, especially Congress, was effectively deaf to the demands of the masses, giving a few tepid reforms at best, leading many to question its raison d'etre. What had happened what we saw for 3 years was jobs vanished, wars which continued, and revolutions which erupted in the Middle East. Now we have the emergence of the Occupy movement here in the United States, which has allowed for us to talk about class again, albeit with the 99-to-1 dichotomy. It is in this context that I would like to discuss Mészáros to you as an activist in Occupy Boston since its opening days, trying to orient strategy with Mészáros' concepts. I believe that István Mészáros can help us illuminate some key questions of our particular historical moment, especially around the dead end of parliamentary reform and the development of mass communist consciousness. To illustrate these points, I intend to refer to my experiences in the Occupy movement and would be happy to elaborate on any of these activities in the question and answer period. So, why did labor and socialist parties move into parliament, especially when these were radicals who were pledged to overturn the system and institute a new social order that would provide for all needs? And parliament was actually the most visible face of that system in many respects. It was where the dominant classes made their decisions. And now, why can they no longer secure reforms from that system? According to Mészáros, at the end of the 19th century, the labor and socialist movement changed from being an extra-parliamentary movement to a parliamentary one. This was related to capital still being in its ascending phase, with imperialist expansion, which was growing the pie and leaving room for capital to maneuver in the granting of concession. An early example of this would be Bismarck in Imperial Germany and the various reforms he instituted of social insurance, healthcare, pension systems, which were intended to deflect a lot of the Social Democratic Party there. And the German Social Democratic Party ended up, despite its stated intentions of actually going along with a lot of this and becoming embedded in this. The labor movement placed its hopes in the established institutions of the capitalist state, namely Parliament, to deliver the goods. Socialist leaders and the emerging mass parties oriented themselves to Parliament with the belief that far-reaching structural reforms from the state could be obtained. Some fervently believed in an evolutionary road or the historical compromise that would ultimately bring socialism. The rhetoric was often different for German social democrats in 1900 or the Italian Communist Party in the 1970s. Yet the moment of socialism never came. The horizon continually receded. Eventually, these parties of whatever name effectively became managers of capitalism, using labor as electoral fodder for the purpose of legitimizing the status quo that is supposedly democratic. In place of the fundamental reform of the capitalist system, what we have now is maybe criticism in minor details with the envisioning of partial correctives at best. Labor's representatives are effectively embedded in the system, and any question of parliament or the liberal democratic horizon is thus taboo. The parliamentary road for socialists is a labor of Sisyphus. And for those of you who don't know, Sisyphus is a Greek myth, and it's about someone who's condemned to the underworld, to one of those places in Tartarus, and his labor is to roll a rock up a hill. And every time, despite all his effort, he gets so close to the top, the rock comes tumbling down. And he has to push the rock up again and again for all eternity. It's insanity because he's doing the same thing again and again and again, expecting different results, just as socialists who are pursuing parliamentary reform in this era are. For one, as Mészáros argues, it is a contradiction in terms to expect a new society to emerge within the capital system. Capital is based on the exploitation of labor, not hard work, not job creators, not out of the goodness of their hearts. It's based on exploitation. That is the very basis of this system. To expect a political decree to abolish this is to expect capital to willingly commit suicide. I will be hardly denied the nihilistic tendencies in capital, but I do not think it willingly wants to kill itself. And secondly, in capitalist society, there is a great divide between political equality and economic inequality. To put it simply, or perhaps overtly simply, there are a few people whom we call capitalists, or the personifications of capital, who have exclusive ownership over the means of production. Then there is the majority who do not own and have to work for a living, the proletariat. This is not reflected when we vote, nor is it reflected in Parliament. Granted, in the ballot box, a worker vote is technically worth the same as a capitalist vote. We ultimately have a disconnect between economic inequality, which traverses society, and a supposed political equality. As Mészáros says many times, capital, the extra parliamentary force par excellence, could exercise power as a matter of course through the capitalist state, its own political command structure, of which Parliament is only a part, and by no means the decisive one. Capital controls vast unelected areas outside of Parliament, from businesses to the courts and the military. All of these forces work to sustain the dominant system. In a sense, real power lies outside of Parliament, and thus that is where the primary blow needs to be struck against capital, not in a legislative chamber or in the voting booth. 3. Parliament was created by the rising capitalist class to serve their interests. Mészáros echoes many of the points of Rousseau's social contract in its critique of Parliament. In a parliamentary system, decision-making is effectively alienated and divorced from the masses. In Parliament, you don't have representatives of workers standing alongside representatives of capitalists, even if it seemingly appears to be that way. Capital controls inside and outside of Parliament, and uses Parliament as a sphere for its political legitimization. If capital's real power is outside of Parliament, then when worker parties have their mode of functioning as playing by parliamentary rules, which are stacked against them, they're denying the possibility of challenging capital's real foundations of power, which, as Mészáros argues, are outside of the parliamentary sphere. A characteristic trait of politics in the United States and elsewhere is that decision-making is controlled by very similar, self-legitimizing, consensual institutional arrangements with little difference between them. And to put it in our US context, we could just say Obama, Bush, Democrat, Republican, or perhaps Labor, Tory, Cameron, Blair. In this situation, the interests of imperialism, expansion at any cost, must prevail. 4. The labor movement follows a defensive strategy, what Mészáros calls the line of least resistance. In this strategy, labor and socialist parties have been able to extract forms from capital. For instance, the social democratic welfare states that were set up in Europe during the post-World War II era. Yet Rosa Luxemburg diagnosed the results of this strategy as it was originally unfolding in the early 20th century. She said that Parliament would serve as a breeding ground for opportunism and dissolve the active class-conscious sector of the proletariat into the mass of the electorate. Thus, passivity in the political arm of the labor movement, the political party which is tied to Parliament, is separated from its industrial arm, the trade unions, which is limited to bargaining over wages and conditions. In deciding to pursue a parliamentary option, labor subordinates itself to capital and serves as a legitimizing force of capital. In the end, reformists, socialists, and unions sought to gain a bigger piece of the capitalist pie through growth, which meant that they ended up supporting the system and revitalizing it, often through Keynesian strategies. Yet, reformist accommodation did little make a lasting impact on capital's contradiction. Well, this does not deny that some of the reforms granted were able to better the life for workers. In the current period, though, the problems facing capital are so immense, ranging from structural unemployment to ecological collapse. Yet the way to significant structural change is effectively blocked in the parliamentary arena. This is because capital has entered what Mészáros calls a structural crisis. It is no longer an ascending phase in which it is able to grant reforms. In a structural crisis, which Mészáros traces back to the early 1970s with the rise of neoliberalism, he devised the crisis as universal, global, with its time scale extended, and its mode of unfolding creeping. A structural crisis, and I quote, affects the totality of a social complex in all its relations with all its constituent parts. This crisis naturally affects politics as well. The structural crisis is thus different from that of 1929. During that period, capital did have room for maneuver and pursued different strategies to overcome the Great Depression, such as the New Deal or fascism. After World War II, capital entered what some would call its golden age, with a shift from the following. There's a shift from outright colonialism to neo-colonialism. We could just see that by looking at a map in 1930, comparing it, say, 30 to 40 years later. The rise of the military-industrial complex, particularly in the United States. The appearance of full employment during and after World War II. Certainly unemployment was never zero, but for a significant time after World War II, if you wanted a job, you could probably find one. And although there were certain portions of the population that were excluded from that. And the rise of the consumer economy, which could be seen, for instance, after World War II, the rise of televisions, to give a great example. Suburbs with all the gizmos and gadgets that everyone needed to keep up, that suddenly were an essential part of life. And we saw, of course, the export of capital to the third world with the perpetuation of underdevelopment and dependency and corresponding super profits. This would, of course, be linked to neocolonialism, and a great example of it would be Latin America. Now, the structural crisis, which can be traced to the 1970s, saw the rise of mass unemployment, the growth of internal contradictions among the imperialist powers, and uprisings in the neo-colonial world. Capital was entering a descending phase. Reformist strategy was blocked along with relative improvements for the working class. Consensus was not working in Parliament, and capital went on the offensive. These social democratic reforms, the welfare state, which had brought tangible benefits to workers, were rolled back. Neoliberalism, personified by the ever-lovely Thatcher and Reagan, was on the order of the day. The structural crisis brought with it a crisis of Marxism. Just witness the rise of the new philosophers in France. Yet, Mészáros points out that the crisis of Marxism results from a defensive posture, when a defensive posture should be pursued. In the words of Gramsci, the old is dying, yet the new cannot be born. The objective potentiality of the socialist offensive results from a structural crisis of capital. If there's a way out, if there is no way out, and no way to gain major reforms by following the line of least resistance in Parliament, then a new strategy is called for. Mészáros believes that this strategy must be an offensive one, and socialists need to reorient themselves accordingly. Mészáros elaborates many points of a strategy, which will only touch on a few and relate them to the Occupy movement. For one, the socialist movement must become an extra-parliamentary mass movement that is consciously active in all forms of social and political struggle and is asserting itself as a hegemonic alternative to capital. As long as the capital system is not challenged, capital and its parliamentary parties will continue to function as the only horizon. We need to move away from there is no alternative, or TINA, and develop our own hegemonic alternative. This shift away from being just a political party that seeks to extract concessions, which can later be nullified by the extra-parliamentary force of capital. That's what we need to do. This is not to say that partial demands should not be advocated by socialists, that they have a direct or indirect bearing on overcoming the capital relation itself and in developing mass consciousness. More to say about this later in regards to occupying the struggle regarding mass transit. What this means here is that socialists need to confront the organizational question by remaining faithful to our principles and developing common programs of action. These common action programs mean that socialists will need a conscious strategic articulation of socialist pluralism, which recognize existing differences among groups and tendencies. These differences are recognized not to be preserved, but to be superseded by securing the active involvement of all concerned in common struggle. Mészáros says that the socialist alternative must be articulated in the form of intermediate objectives whose realization can make strategic inroads, even if these inroads are partial ones, into the capitalist system. In fact, what will decide the fate of socialists is the effect to which they can make tangible inroads into everyday life. To illustrate this point, look at the threats to mass transit here in Boston. I'll give no more than a brief outline of that, but to suffice to say, the MBTA is planning a series of service cuts and rate hikes to cover their budget deficit of $161 million. Disproportionately affected will be seniors who depend on public transit, workers who need to get to their jobs, and students who need to get to school, and oppressed communities. The crisis stems from the state of Massachusetts not adequately funding the T, but in straddling the public transportation system with billions in debt from other projects such as the Big Dig. Sales taxes were unable to meet the T's needs, so the T turned to complex financial deals with banks, many of which I might add were bailed out in 2007-2008, which resulted in nearly 25% of the T's debt going to serve as interest to the banks. The ruling class says there isn't enough money to fund public transit, though. Yet those funds exist to bail out the banks and to engage in wars. Furthermore, why not just tax the rich to cover the deficit, or just expropriate them? Why should workers who depend on the T to get to work have to suffer? As the Boston Occupier, our Occupy paper says, a 1% tax on the richest 1% would yield funds sufficient not only to eliminate the current deficit, but to completely fund free public transportation. To bring it back, the T struggle goes to what Mészáros is saying about the socialist offensive. For one, it involves the everyday life of people. For example, when you're passing out papers, flyers, on the train explaining that your fares are going up and your service being cut, the problem is confronted very directly by those concerned. Secondly, the T struggle offers common action for socialists and others who are active. This can be seen from the many meetings and demonstrations held thus far. The T crisis is a common campaign that focuses on the structural crisis of capital and with resulting effects such as attack on public services, bank bailouts, the cost of labor, and anti-racism. Socialist demands are partly embedded in the solution, such as free public transportation and perhaps a transitional demand of tax the rich. Finally, in explaining the T crisis to people at meetings and demonstrations, the message is largely for the conscious involvement of those concerned, whether through civil disobedience or passing up papers, although there is some pressure for lobbying as well. In order for this campaign to take off, groups are involved. Common action means that Occupy Boston's various working groups need to be involved, such as the Boston Occupier, newspaper, Occupy Boston TV, and other groups as well. Furthermore, other Occupy groups in local towns such as Somerville, which have been springing up in the past few months, are being drawn into the struggle. The large portion of activists involved in the struggle are by and large not seeking to redress their grievances through the parliamentary structure, but by some form of direct action. This covers the common action which Mészáros speaks of, but what of the remaining faithful to and building the socialist alternative? A provisional example I can give regards recent developments in Boston around the Occupy movement in developing that alternative. For instance, a collective of non-sectarian communists called Red Horizon was recently formed. The Red Horizon Collective works diligently through the many Occupy working groups and Occupy the T, and is working to the Occupy the T campaign. Red Horizon is worth group holds aloft the banner of a potentially different future, hence its name. Well engaged in serious work around Occupy the T. Red Horizon has certain oriented goals geared toward practical struggle, which sidesteps sectarianism, developing consciousness that leads to a socialist future. Other Occupy groups are also seeing the rise of new communist groups, such as the Oakland Commune. Again, this is a very provisional example of what Mészáros is speaking of in regards to taking the socialist offensive. It is a seed, a hopeful one, that comes from taking the offensive in capital's current crisis. I can continue with elaborations of the role of the Howard Zinn Memorial Lecture Series, the question of demands at Occupy, especially when we have the encampment at Dewey Square, and the pluses and minuses of the Socialist Caucus in relation to Mészáros on the socialist offensive. I'd like to conclude by saying that we can see the objective potentiality of the socialist offensive, which results from the structural crisis of capital manifesting in the Occupy movement, and this poses a potential red horizon, not just the group, but a perspective that leads beyond liberal democracy and capitalism. Thank you.
Okay, I think it would be appropriate if anyone has some clarifying questions for Doug. We could take maybe 5 minutes or so, and people have things that they really want to ask him in relation to what he said. I think it would be appropriate to do that now. We would like to have a larger discussion at the end of all the presentations, but does anyone have,
what is your understanding of Mészáros' analysis of the most powerful groupings that exist outside of the parliamentary system in the private sphere?
What do you mean by that? Like,
you just said that Mészáros says that the centers of power are not in
yes.
Parliament; they're somewhere else.
They are.
What are they? How do they operate?
Well, the military, for one. I mentioned the courts. There would be the various, what Gramsci would call like the civil society, the various forms that exist, and of course, capital gets its very mode of being from the exploitation of labor, and these are the centers of power, and it's really,
Well, I would say the centers of power are multinational corporations and their owners and operators.
That's
Is that what?
yeah, I mean those are capitalists as well, and those would be obviously the largest examples of capitalists, and these centers of power, like the army, exists to protect the capital relation. Granted, at times, it may benefit the popular class. It's the same with the courts. It will ultimately benefit private property, but if someone is accused of rape, that can, in a sense, help to serve to legitimize the system. In a sense, when you're bringing those type of cases to court, it's showing that it's not just a narrow horizon of class interest, but it does extend in a certain sense of legitimization.
In my view, the center of power is not the army, not the courts, not the parliament, not the executive. It's strictly the owners and operators of multinational corporations. And everything else that you mentioned serves that center of power. I don't know, is that what, does Mészáros think that?
I believe he's arguing for the collective capitalist class, and I
see, okay.
I mean, there are obviously different gradations within the capitalist class, like multinational capitalists, but then of course if we are to take there would be the mom and pop store in a sense. They are exploiting labor, but I don't think they have quite the same power as, say, Monsanto or like, Standard Oil or such. And that of course changes like class alliances and how you would articulate strategy, of course.
You had a question?
Yeah. My name's Marty. Also been down with Occupy Boston. I came because the title Occupy Conscience has been very involved with the Faith and Spirituality group and the Decolonize to Liberate working group, which looks at the effects of colonialism on our collective psychology. But I'm not familiar with the work of this writer here, and I'm wondering, is he still alive? Is this written? This is contemporary, and
he is still alive. Is he still in Hungary? I believe.
He's in England.
Oh, he's England. He's in England. He originally comes from Hungary, and he was a disciple of Lukács, familiar with George Lukács, History and Class Consciousness, great work of Hegelian Marxism. And he's been very influential currently in Venezuela. If you read some of the speeches of Hugo Chavez, he actually refers to him quite a great deal. And you can, there's actually there's introductory material if you need to, like, on the Marxist.org website, they have some material as well, monthly review.
I'll check that out. Like, my question particularly is about, you use the word dichotomy, and I think you're referring to the 99
Yes.
ones. If you could just speak to more about how the idea of a dichotomy plays into this school of thought and your thoughts.
Well, I think the dichotomy is open. It opens a certain discussion of class, because when you're defining, when you're saying there's the 1% and the 99, you have to kind of articulate, well, who's the 1%? Is it the multinational corporations? Is the 1% the mom and pop store? Who's in the 99%? Do we include rich basketball players? Do we include workers? Is the 99% the working class? How do you articulate the demands of the 99%? And it would, a lot of it would, I would believe, not just come out in discussions, but through various forms of common action. For instance, I believe there is the, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there a women's march scheduled for today?
Noon at Boston Common.
Noon at Boston Common, which at least I won't be able to make. But it's like, when are women part of the 99%? How do we articulate their demands? How do we articulate their interests? And you could give various other examples as well.
Emmanuel, sorry. I had a question. So I was a bit confused at one point when you were discussing how in the 1970s there was a crisis of capitalism. As I understand it, capitalism of course goes through periodic crises. But you said that the crisis of capitalism in the 1970s resulted or had the consequence of a crisis in Marxism. But wasn't the crisis of Marxism in a way doesn't that predate that by the fact that during 1917 or even before that when you had the revisionist crisis, there were other forms of, what's the connection?
The truth is, I probably should have actually emphasized, when I said crisis of Marxism, at least in this, I actually had it in the scare quotes. There's always a crisis of Marxism. 100 years ago, I forget, I cannot quote you the exact writer. It was around 1908, 1910. Marxism was declared effectively dead. Okay, I believe a large dealing with the revisionist controversy. And a lot of it, the crisis may resolve from a certain poverty of thought that develops around, or following certain strategies, obviously with the rise of, say, Stalin, there was a certain crisis in what some would call official Marxism or Soviet Marxism. It was just following certain strategies that were not going to lead to socialism, which ultimately ended up, at least, to give the example of the Italian Communist Party, probably the least Stalinist party in Europe, ultimately, its policies of Euro-communism, of the historical compromise, could be traced to its adoption of a lot of its policies, say early with the Popular Front, the Salerno turn in Italy, it was following this whole defensive posture.
But with regards to the 1970s?
In regards to the 1970s, I think a part of it would deal with the crisis of Marxism, so-called, would deal with probably a downturn in a certain sense of the revolutionary struggle, which had seen its high point in 1968 and was starting to come down. And a lot of activists who had maybe expected the horizon to suddenly be that red horizon fairly soon were kind of becoming disillusioned and pushing back. You had the whole Solzhenitsyn phenomenon that attracted a lot of those new philosophers, and they're just pulling back from that, and the whole discourse of human rights and neoliberalism was becoming on the ascendant. And it was related, I can only give a very cursory outline here, but Vietnam, Keynesian strategies were just not working. There's the whole stagflation and everything.
Great. Now I think we'll hold on the rest of the questions for Doug till at the end of this. So I'm going to do a short presentation here on the volume 1 of Mészáros' recent work, the social determination of method. Of course, it's a major work, and I can't in any way summarize or deal with all the important stuff that's in that book. It'll just be giving you a hint of some of the important things in it. From my perspective, I think one of the things that we have to do, though, is in order to make these tools usable or more easily used, we need to recognize Mészáros' distinction between capital and capitalism. Capital, from Mészáros' point of view, or excuse me, capitalism is just the most recent form or phase of capital formation. Prior to capitalism, there was capital, and capital is really in the background of supporting the capitalist system, and the capital formation can also post-date capitalism. A good example of the latter is what happened in the 20th century. Okay, now there's chairs, if you wouldn't mind, there's chairs downstairs, you can bring them up, they're folding chairs. They're right down to the right as you go down the stairs, you'll see them. Bring a chair up, you can join in. So anyway, what Mészáros characterizes the Soviet model as post-capitalist capital. In other words, all of these formations have features that include the subordination and control of the laboring classes and the extraction of surplus labor or surplus value from these classes. This is a characteristic of capital. And there are many ways to look at the system, of course, but there's two major that I can think of. And one of them is that capital is an objective force, and we have to accept it to a large degree because it's never going to change. People who internalize this point of view tell us not to bother with these dreams of a socialist alternative because it will never happen here. They advise rather be realistic, work to reform the system, make it a little less warlike, a little more just, a little more environmentally friendly. Okay. And it's like, well, it could be said, if that's possible, can it be reformed? It might be like trying to put a monster on a leash. That may not work too well. And, well, there is an element of truth in this view, of course, that capital has been around a long time. It's very powerful. But that point of view that says we should accept it overlooks some of the details of how the capital system actually works and controls us, and also asserts its power over us, and also overlooks the very real openings that we have to really change the whole system. And so there's another point of view, which comes before us with the Mészáros work and other thinkers like István Mészáros. It offers us that closer look we need at how capital dominates us, and also a viable alternative that we can think about. And of course, because Mészáros takes on that much, it's also the most comprehensive work. It effectively appreciates and criticizes the historically unfolding experience of all of us and our ancestors. So that makes it a little more challenging, but very rewarding. So faced with this challenging material, there's a couple of questions that emerge. One is, how do we respond to such challenging intellectual material? And the other question would be, what forms of social organization facilitate awareness of Mészáros' work? And for those of us who are willing to respond positively to that challenge. And that's where I want to mention a few things about our local discussion groups that are coming up in April. April will be both here in the Boston area and online. For people outside of the Boston area, essential discussions, which I'm one of the coordinators, will host discussions on Volume 1 of Mészáros' Social Structure and Forms of Organization, Social Determination Method, which is published by the Monthly Review Press in 2010. These discussion groups will meet every 3 weeks, and we read the material on our own and systematically deal with the material and discussions every 3 weeks. By putting our heads together and thinking together and working together, we can actually figure almost anything out, including this, a challenging text. I know that from my experience. So if you're interested in participating in these discussions, get a copy of Volume 1 and get in touch with Essential Discussions. The contact information is on the flyer that you got. So as a brief introduction to some of the many tools, just a few of the many tools available to us in social structure and forms of consciousness, I want to address Mészáros' concept of second-order mediations and mediations. Actually, there's 3 levels that he refers to that I think are very important when we think about how capital dominates us and how we can really change that and develop a system in which the mediations take a more equal form where we all participate in the decision-making processes. When I use the word mediations, I mean the usual definition, which is the intersection or intervention for settling differences or bringing about a result. In the case of capital, the result is profits. There's 3 types of mediations that Mészáros raises. The first one is called primary mediations. The second is second-order mediations of the capital system. And the third is second-order mediations of the viable communal socialist alternative. The primary mediations, or the first-order mediations, are those which any society, any social forum has to meet in order to function. And briefly, they can be summed up as maintaining a sustainable match between the population size and the available resources. The second, regulation of the labor force or labor process. Third, establishment of appropriate exchange relations. 4, the organization and coordination of control of the increasingly complex material and cultural activities and making them safe and safeguarded. And 5, the rational allocation of available resources. And 6, the last one, the enactment and administration of rules and regulations of the given society as a whole. It's important to notice, if you think about all those 6, that none of them require hierarchical control or command. The capital system, which features that, gathers those from other roots in history. So the second-order mediation of the capital system can be summed up as the nuclear family, the alienated means of production, money in its historically evolving form, the fetishistic production objectives set by capital, labor, structurally divorced from control in the workplace, the varieties of capital formation in their states formation in their global setting, and lastly, the uncontrollable world market. Through these 8 is really the heart of how the capital system controls us, from the family to the world market. And the mediator, capital, enters in each of those forms. In the patriarchal head of the household or the world market, it emerges and controls us. So all of these second-order mediations will have to relate to the primary mediations. In order, in capital, they do, in a distorted and very wasteful way, they relate to those primary mediations. The historical roots of capital's second-order mediations go back a long way in history. The chronologically most recent emerged in the last 400 years, which is during the phase of capitalism. Before that, over a much longer time scale, other second-order mediations were consolidated, like early monetary and merchant capital, and even before that, the earliest phase of development of these mediations appeared with hierarchical control in the division of labor, assuming in due course a variety of forms of class domination. Well, all of these second-order mediations over time have been incorporated into the capitalist system, from the family to the controlling structures of the labor process and so on. Their role, as I mentioned, is to protect the system, even the most destructive parts of it. They do this by controlling people and mystifying them at all levels of social interaction, from the macrocosmic to the microcosmic. At the global level, they sustain the global pecking order of capital through the various state formations. At the national level, they sustain the myth that we all voluntarily accept the system as an alternative. They're able to create hegemonic force in people's thinking, so that anything outside of the structural framework of these second-order mediations has to be rejected as an outrage. So those who accept the capitalist system and embrace it see part of the Occupy Wall Street movement as such an outrage. And they also see, as they've seen struggles against racism and war and against capital in the past, as outrages. This part of the Occupy Wall Street movement, I think, offers its greatest hope for transforming the capital system and its second-order mediations. So, as Mészáros argues, the real target of a viable alternative, he calls it a viable communal socialist alternative, must be the displacement and replacement of the second-order mediations of the capitalist system and the capitalist system as a whole. In fact, he says, quote, "The meaning of the socialist project is the establishment of a set of practically viable second-order mediations controlled not by some mysterious impersonal entity like the world spirit or any of its variants, nor a mythical collective, but by the real individuals." So, it would be useful for us to think about alternative second-order mediations to the capitalist system. And I think if we put our mind there and begin to think these through, we can develop an alternative. Mészáros argues that they features what he calls substantive equality rather than formal equality, which is a very important distinction that I'll go into in a little while. Also self-mediation, where in fact we are the mediators in our own experience rather than having someone else dictating it to us or being the directing will, whoever that force is. In other words, the old wobbly point, we are all leaders, is what this self-mediation means. We take responsibility for the future. It seems like a big project, but so how can we do this? Well, there are ways, and I think one of them is to recognize the important point that these second-order mediations in the capitalist system that I mentioned are filled with contradictions. For example, the family, when you think of it within the family, next to you, the family, within the family exist really socialist and communal values. And they exist side by side and often collide with the patriarchal values in the family. So that's a point where you can see the struggle going on, struggle in the family. Also, the crises of the system and in the system expose all of the contradictions in each of these second-order mediations. Because they're really composed of people doing things in a certain patterned way. It's traditional or accepted, but it can be contradicted by people, the feminist movement, the anti-racist movement, the peace movement, Occupy Wall Street movement, are all contradicting some of these patterns. So it is possible to transform them, especially in a crisis of capital or within capital, or work on changing. Also, the features of the second order mediations can be developed. Other features can be developed right now. And as Mészáros argues, they would feature substantive equality and social self-mediation instead of the hierarchical command and control of capital, the personifications of capital. These new horizontal relations would be, primarily where the social development of each and of all is a condition for developing a self-determined and self-mediating, self-controlling, productive activity by the social individuals. I think that idea is growing in human history. This is why worker control, community control, self-management, and protagonistic participation in building the future are central features of the struggle right now, and you can see that in the Occupy movement. Within each of these, worker control, self-management, community control, the struggle beyond formal equality into substantive equality is there. And also against a system that highlights just the production of things in quantity that has beyond any reason, any rational way of producing things. Within these, worker control, etc., we can put forward a radically different definition of wealth, where quality is over quantity, where use value is over exchange value, and where time for human development is over wage labor time. So, all around us, the crisis of capital exposes the extreme limitations on its form of formal equality. And the time has arrived for its transcendence by substantive equality. Now, substantive equality as a movement really appeared during the French Revolution, when Babeuf in the Society of Equals raised the issue. Unfortunately, they were defeated and went to the guillotine. And since that time, the struggle for substantive equality has emerged, by the struggles of majorities and minorities, people of color, workers, women, gays, peace activists, and ecology activists. So its time is now. Okay, just a few questions.
This is a question of fact. Irv, I think some people might appreciate a page reference if you've got one there. To the second order mediations.
139 of Beyond Capital.
Yeah, and how about in the book that we'll be discussing?
I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that. It's page 109 to 110.
109 to 110.
Right.
Okay.
Anything else? Any other questions before we go on, or?
I was just, I guess a small question. I was wondering about, when you're speaking about second order mediations. To me, it appears that this is more since the 1970s. And so, sort of, identifying smaller, what Doug called it intermediate targets, and sort of working towards fulfilling, or at least demanding some. And the tactics that sort of come along with them, which is worker control or occupations, are something that also we've been seeing since the 70s. But the sort of, the character of the left clearly has changed since the 70s. And so has, sort of the way, it could be argued that sort of capitalism itself has changed as well. So, I mean, it just seems to me then like it's, I'm not familiar with the work, but I'm sort of looking at the way it's been read here. It almost seems sort of like a reading into the Occupy movement then, of like, this is sort of the way in which the Occupy movement can go, but the thing is that this is the direction that the left has been taking for the last 40 years, or more actually. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to that it just, how do those two things sort of speak to each other?
Good question. Well, actually, I don't have an answer, but I would start with that. You'll start with that. So,
Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
So, if it's all right, we'll go on unless someone has a very pressing question that they can't wait.
I have a question though, just to clarify for further questions. What was the third mediating aspect of this? Because I know I had some thing to do with
there were two.
communism.
The second order mediations of the socialist alternative.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a quick point to add, this is all being recorded, so eventually you'll be able to go back and rewatch and find portions that you missed.
Very good.
Let me introduce myself. My name is Mario Rendon. I am a Colombian American. I am a psychiatrist, I'm a child psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. So, I have been very impressed by Mészáros' work, which is complex for the reason that he speaks to philosophers. So, what he is doing is updating historical materialism and analytical materialism. And in the way he's critiquing the classical political economists, the vulgar political economists, Hegel, Kant, Sartre, Popper, Hayek. So it's an update of Marxism, but at the same time it is a critique of all these movements that have tried to occupy the space of Marxism, but that have been unable to. And the reason that they have been unable to, according to Mészáros, is that they don't start from the base. They start from knowledge, they start from spirit, they start from idea, but they don't start from the base. And the quality of Marx's work is that he started from the base. So we have to stand on the ground, he tells us. So I'm going to, let me see, I'm going to do a graph here. You don't have to worry about copying it because I'm going to give you copies of it at the end. I have a little card with a copy of it. And this, let's make believe that this is consciousness. And let's say that we're going to occupy this consciousness with Mészáros' concepts. In other words, this is the way Mészáros occupied my consciousness. Okay? This is my representation of Mészáros. First of all, is the ground. Okay? He talks actually about the ground, essentially the cosmos, matter, right? The cosmos, where we stand, we are part of that cosmos. You know, we usually think that the cosmos is, you know, out there, but this is the cosmos here. This is the cosmos, and that's a good question that we should think about. Where does the cosmos start, and where does consciousness begin? Where do they meet? Anyway, he talks about the ground. This is essentially because we are materialists. We believe that everything starts from the ground, and we believe that we emerge from the ground, right? Cosmos, evolution, life, right? Human life, the new species in the Darwinian process a new species appear that is self-mediating. What does it mean, self-mediating? It means we create our own problems. Essentially, that's what it means. So, we create problems and we mediate them. We create problems and we solve them. That's mediation. Mediation is problem solving. Simple. At the end of this cosmic idea that Mészáros talked about, it's very interesting because he talks particularly about cosmic time. And cosmic time is so big that we don't know it. We don't know a little part of it. And he says that the theory of the Big Bang is a measure of how little we know. It's a myth. It's a creation story about the beginning of the universe, but it's just the limitation of our knowledge. We just know that far. It doesn't mean that that is the truth, the absolute truth. So, within cosmic time, there is a small segment that is historical time. And historical time is the time that man has made. History is man-made historical time. Is different from cosmic time. Cosmic time goes on, no matter what, steps on anyone. It doesn't care, human, not human. Cosmic time goes on. Historical time is different. Historical time could even be reversed. We could regress. We could go back historically. If we destroy part of the world, we'll probably go back. We'll destroy most of history, and we will, with atomic bombs and so on, we could regress historically. So historical time is very different from cosmic time. The same with space. Space, cosmic space, we don't even know it. We speculate, but we have a little bit of cosmic space that we know, that we have mapped out, planets, stars, etc. And that's historical space. Man created, delineated space. Okay? So at the end of this, the most important concept is natural necessity. Natural necessity. Natural necessity is natural mediation. Nature mediates, right? How does nature mediate? Let's take a chemical reaction, which Engels spoke about in the dialectics of nature. And you take, you take H2 plus O, right? Then we have two beings, two substances, and they disappear. They disappear and produce water. The production of water implies the destruction of these entities as individual entities, right? Now, life is different because life is not mutual destruction. Life, when we eat, we destroy one part, but we don't destroy ourselves. Is that clear? The difference between the two levels, life is not mutual destruction, but unilateral destruction. When we eat, we destroy, right? Okay, so natural necessity is what all animals have to cope with. Nature has its laws, and all animals have to abide by nature's laws because they are not self-mediated. There is one exception, and that's man. Man is the species that doesn't absolutely have to abide by natural necessity, but that fights natural necessity. So, the human history, the history of humanity, is the history of fighting natural necessity. Okay? And fighting natural necessity is pushing it, pushing nature. Okay? Like when we take an airplane, we are defying the law of gravity, right? And eventually, once in a while, we are reminded that the laws of gravity are operational. They are latent. We have pushed them, but they are latent there. And that's what we worry about with capitalism, that we have pushed nature so far that we are scared that nature is going to react at some point and there's going to be a catastrophic outcome of that. So that's natural necessity. Man introduces mediations because man is a self-mediating being. And perhaps the first mediation was to take a stone and make the edge cutting and then use the stone for spears or for cutting meat. So that's the introduction of an instrument. And that instrument, that tool, is the first mediation. And that first mediation is with the purpose of pushing nature. We are saving time and we're increasing productivity, right? We get a good knife, we cut faster, we increase productivity. Productivity is a conscious mediation. So there's a material mediation and there's a conscious mediation that are parallel. Now, let's say we divide the space here, and the title of the book is Social Structure. And then forms of consciousness. Okay? Now, one of the things that Mészáros tells us that's very important methodologically for us is, number one, first look inside. We are inside, we look at the facts, we look at what's going on in society, right? So, let's say that this is the inside. Then he said we have to step outside and look from the outside, right? In order to understand. And when we step outside, we step here, and we step here, here and here. Now, what is here? Here is reciprocal action. It's very interesting because reciprocal action. Very interesting because Mészáros really, I was wondering why didn't he put here dialectical method, but he chose reciprocal action. And he says it's a limited metaphor because it comes from Newton, it comes from mechanics, it's the third law of motion. Right. Reciprocal action, the third law of motion, right? So he says that in spite of the limitation, because it comes from mechanics, not dialectics, it's a very good metaphor because it indicates that these two here are in reciprocal action, the same way that these two were in reciprocal action, right? Reciprocal action is the dialectical conceptualization of Mészáros, in which both the base and the superstructure have the same causative power, even though in the last instance the ground prevails, because consciousness cannot exist without the ground, but the ground can exist without consciousness. And that's what cosmic time will do if we don't take care of nature. Okay? So, reciprocal action is very much the mechanism that prevails in this model of Mészáros. And here is another metaphor that we step out to understand the facts inside, and this is the superstructure and the base. He says that this is a wonderful metaphor in spite of the fact that it's also limited, because it is a spatial, it's like a building. You have a foundation and you have the superstructure. It's spatial, it's limited. It doesn't really reflect the dialectical nature of the interaction. But he says it's the best explanatory model. It has the most explanatory power, because from